Welcome to IFA. I fix everything.
Today's project is the Pontiac Fiero Seized Brake Caliper, Part 3. Part 3 will include the reassembly of both the front and rear brake calipers. The Pontiac Fiero Seized Brake Caliper Part 1 included the diagnosis, the removal, and disassembly of all 4 brake calipers. The Seized Brake Caliper Part 2 included the cleaning and polishing of the brake calipers. Before reassembly can begin, all the parts must be final cleaned with alcohol to remove any dust that may have settled and the body oils. Special attention is paid to any internal cavities and internal components. DOT3 brake fluid is the service specification for a Pontiac Fiero. The system has been completely drained. I am going to be using DOT3 synthetic brake fluid. The piston, the seals, and the bore will be pre-lubricated with brake fluid. This will aid in installation and prevent tears. I was able to purchase Delco parts from an online source. I dipped the components in a container of new brake fluid to ensure good saturation. Insert the square-edged piston seal into the groove of the piston bore. Add additional brake fluid to lubricate the seal and then press it carefully around the circumference to ensure it's properly seated. Generously lubricate the piston dust boot with brake fluid and carefully slip it over the piston, seating it in the outer ring groove. With the seal firmly seated in the piston groove, expand the accordion seal toward the rear of the piston. Before installation, I added additional brake fluid to the brake piston and carefully insert the piston, aligning it to the bore. Rest the outer lip of the piston dust boot against the rim of the piston bore. In this image, I'm using an inexpensive steering wheel puller without the additional bolts to press the piston into the bore. A used brake pad and a bolt could also be fashioned into a piston press. As the piston receded into the bore, the seal collapsed and seated itself. I rolled the round head of a boxed wrench around the circumference and completely seated the seal. I loosely applied a squeeze clamp to the brake piston and caliper and applied air pressure to exercise the piston and check for binding. Then I reseated the piston with the squeeze clamp. This will ensure the piston is sliding smoothly without binding. Now I've turned my attention to the rear brake caliper. The rear brake caliper piston has an emergency brake actuator screw that applies mechanical disc brake pressure to stop the car. I purged the brake caliper piston by pouring alcohol into the rear hydraulic chamber. I flushed the piston until the alcohol returned clear on the white paper towel. The actuator screw, self-installed, it's ready for installation. I seated the balance spring into the rear of the piston and listened for the snap. I'm using an aluminum pick to remove the shaft seal and thrust washer. I pre-lubricated the rubber components in brake fluid. Install the copper thrust washer with the copper face facing the piston and the grayish face facing the caliper. I used a hand clamp as an extra set of hands as I slipped the seal over the hexagon head of the actuator screw. Next, I installed the pre-soaked brake piston seal into the piston bore groove. I inspected the seal to make sure it was seated properly. Then I lubricated the piston bore with brake fluid. Use extra caution while installing the dust boot on the rear brake piston. The sharp edges could tear the seal quite easily. After seating the dust boot in the piston groove, I expanded the seal. With the spring installed and the actuator screw extended, I aligned the spring to the bore and pressed the piston in place. I compressed the balance spring and placed a spacer between the piston and the caliper body. Next, I checked the alignment of the actuator screw to the rear hole of the brake caliper. When the actuator screw aligned to the hole, I pressed the piston slightly until the threads protruded, then I started the nut onto the threads to hold it in place. I rotated the nut with a wrench until the thrust washer seated against the interior caliper wall. Then I bridged the actuator screw with a large socket. Next, I compressed the piston with a C-clamp. The socket allowed the actuator screw to rotate as the piston was receding into the bore. Once again, I used a box wrench to seat the lip of the dust boot seal into the bore. Then I removed the nut, installed the anti-friction washer and the lever seal, followed by the lever and the nut. Next, I lubricated and installed the piston check valve into the center port. Next, I snapped the pad damping spring into the outer lip of the piston with the notch facing down to accept the tab on the inner brake pad. I loosely installed the bleeder screw and the banjo bolt to prevent contamination. I used compressed air to remove any loose contaminants from the caliper cavities. I generously coated the walls of the cavity with synthetic brake grease. I pre-lubricated and installed the rubber bushings into the groove at each end of the brake cavity. Next, I pre-lubricated and installed the brake bolt boots. I found a spark plug socket makes an excellent installation tool by pressing the shoulder tight and seating the boots. Notice the detent in the brake caliper pin sleeve. The sleeves must be reinstalled on the pins to function properly and allow the installation of the brake caliper bolts. I applied a thin coat of synthetic brake grease to the pins prior to assembly. I employed a bench vise as a simple press. I tapped the threads to remove the flat spot that was created by the detent in the sleeve when I installed the pin. I used a wire wheel mounted to a bench grinder to deburr the threads and make starting the bolts easier. Prior to installation, I pre-lubed the exterior of the bolts and pins with synthetic brake grease. Notice how the once seized brake bolts that were driven out with a hammer and punch now float freely. With the bolts installed and lubricated, the dust boots can be installed without tools. The head of the bolt expands and supports the boot as you press it in place. I applied synthetic brake grease to the face of the piston to prevent squealing. Rest the tab of the inner brake pad in the notch of the spring clip. Then carefully attach the hooks to the brake backing pad without disengaging the spring clip from the piston. This can be easier said than done. Here's a second method I used to install the inner brake pad. I turned the caliper on its side to allow easier access to the brake clip. I used a hook scribe with some patience. Here's a close-up shot of the spring hooks wrapped around the brake pad backing plate. With both pads installed, I test fit the clearance by slipping a brake rotor between the two pads. This will ensure easy installation on the car. The front brake caliper pads are next. Notice the difference in the brake caliper piston. The hole in the center is not to reduce weight, but works in conjunction with the anti-rattle clip. The anti-rattle clip is installed on the rear of the brake caliper pad. High-temperature synthetic brake grease is applied to the back of the brake pad and the anti-rattle clip. The 4 spring-loaded ears must be compressed evenly as the pad is pressed into the piston. I used a screwdriver to guide the spring clips into the hole. I pressed down one side of the brake pad, locking the spring into the divot. Then I rotated the pad, pressing the other side into its divot. The emergency brake cable bracket slips over the dust boot and installs with the torque screw. To prevent the actuator screw from rotating as I tightened the nut, I clamped vice grips to the lever to act as a handle. The torque specifications for the actuator nut are 40 to 50 foot-pounds. The torque specifications for the bracket mount bolt is between 24 and 38 foot-pounds. I hope you enjoyed part 3 of the seized brake calipers on the 1986 Pontiac Fiero. If you did, Please remember to like and share, and remember, subscribers are always welcome.